My brother Daniel stood at the head of my mother's dining table like he was making a campaign speech, one hand wrapped around a wine glass, the other resting on the back of my chair as if even that belonged to him. The turkey had barely been carved. My aunt was still passing cranberry sauce, and then Daniel tapped his glass with a fork and said, smiling, "I think it's time everyone knew the truth. As of this week, I'm the owner of my sister's company." The room changed in one breath. Not loud at first. Just that sharp, hungry silence families get when something ugly has finally arrived wearing good manners. My mother blinked at me, then at him like she was already choosing which version of the story would be easier to live with. My cousin let out a tiny laugh, thinking it was a joke. "It wasn'. Single quotes T." Daniel lifted his glass higher. "Don't worry," he said to me, soft enough to sound kind, cruel enough for everyone to hear. "You'll still have a place." Every face turned toward me, waiting for the crack. I smiled, to understand why no one at that table questioned. "Danielle, you have to understand the roles we were assigned long before either of us could push back." Danielle was the golden child, not because he earned it, but because he performed it. He was loud where I was quiet, charming where I was careful, and endlessly forgiven where I was endlessly expected to do better. When Daniel dropped out of his first business venture, my mother called it a learning experience. When I worked 60-hour weeks building something real, she asked me when I was going to find something stable. That was the rhythm of our family. Daniel fell upward. I succeeded invisibly. He could walk into any room and make people believe he belonged at the center of it. And my family loved that about him. They mistook volume for vision. They confused confidence with competence. And because I never fought for attention, they assumed I never deserved it. My company was never taken seriously by any of them. Not when I launched it from a studio apartment, with borrowed furniture. Not when I hired my first employee. Not even when revenue crossed a threshold that would have made Daniel a hero if he had been the one behind it. To them, it was always just something I did because I did not know how to do anything more exciting. My mother once referred to it at a family dinner as my little project, and no one corrected her. Daniel, meanwhile, was always between things, between jobs, between plans, between promises. But the family treated his potential like currency, something valuable that never needed to be proven, only believed in, and they believed. I started the company the year I turned 27. With no investors, no safety net, and no one in my family who thought it would last longer than a season. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment the night before launch, staring at my laptop screen, terrified that every person who had ever doubted me was right. But I hit publish anyway. I opened the doors anyway. I showed up the next morning anyway. Even though not a single person in my family asked me how it went. The first 2 years nearly broke me. I did everything myself. Bookkeeping at midnight, client calls during lunch, deliveries on weekends. I skipped holidays, not because I wanted to, but because I could not afford to stop moving. I missed my cousin's wedding because I was fulfilling an order that would keep the lights on for another month. No one asked why I was absent. They just noted it. There were nights I sat in my car outside the office and cried. Not because the work was too hard, but because no one saw it. I was not building something to prove a point. I was building something because it was mine, the only thing in my life that reflected who I actually was instead of who my family had decided I should be. Every late night was a brick in something real. Every sacrifice carved out space that no one else had given me. And slowly, it worked. Revenue grew. I hired a small team. I signed contracts that gave me stability for the first time in my adult life. I was proud, not loudly, not the way Daniel would have been, but deeply. In a way I carried quietly because no one around me wanted to hear it. The irony is that my family only started paying attention once the company became something they could not ignore. Suddenly there were questions at dinners. Suddenly my mother mentioned it to friends. But even then, the interest was never about me. It was about the thing I had built, becoming large enough to be useful to someone else. About 8 months before that Thanksgiving, Daniel reappeared in my life with a warmth I had not felt from him in years. He started calling more often, texting casually, asking how things were going in a way that almost felt genuine. Almost. At first I wanted to believe it was real, that maybe he had matured, that maybe distance had softened whatever competition he had always quietly carried. But something about the timing unsettled me. He began asking questions about the company, not surface-level questions either. He wanted to know about revenue streams, profit margins, vendor relationships. and operating costs. He framed it as curiosity, as brotherly interest, but the questions were too specific, too pointed. He would say things like, "You must be overwhelmed handling all of this alone." Or, "Have you thought about bringing someone in to help with the financial side?" Each question carried an assumption underneath it that I was struggling, that I was in over my head, that what I really needed was someone like him. My mother encouraged it. She called me one evening and said Daniel had been talking about wanting to support my work and that I should let him in. She used the word family like it was supposed to override every instinct telling me to be careful. "He is your brother," she said. "He just wants to help." But I had spent my entire adult life learning the difference between people who want to help and people who want to position themselves. Daniel started showing up at my office unannounced. He would chat with my employees, compliment the setup, linger near paperwork he had no business reading. Once I'd found him in my office looking at a supplier contract on my desk. And when I asked what he was doing, he laughed and said he was just admiring how far I had come. The words sounded right. The energy behind them did not. He began mentioning investors, expansion strategies, and growth opportunities as though he had been studying the business for months. And maybe he had, but his interest was never in building something alongside me. It was in attaching his name to what already worked. 6 months before Thanksgiving, I hit a rough patch. A major client delayed payment for 90 days, and the cash flow gap created a temporary financing problem that I needed to solve quickly. It was not a crisis. It was the kind of thing every business owner deals with eventually. But I made the mistake of mentioning it at a family dinner, casually, the way you might mention a stressful week without expecting it to become ammunition. Dunya called me the next day. He said he knew someone who could help, a private lender who worked with small businesses and could bridge the gap fast. I told him I was already handling it through my bank, but he was persistent. He said the lender could move faster, that the terms would be better, than I was wasting time going through traditional channels. When I pushed back, my mother called within the hour. She told me I was being stubborn, that Daniel was only trying to help, and that I should stop treating family like strangers, so I agreed to a meeting. Daniel brought a man named Richard, well-dressed, professional, convincing. The paperwork looked clean at first glance. A short-term bridge loan, with reasonable terms, secured against future receivables. Daniel sat in the meeting like he had arranged something extraordinary, nodding along as though he understood every clause. I read everything carefully, asked questions, and ultimately signed what I believed was a straightforward financing agreement. What I did not know at the time was that Daniel had a separate arrangement with Richard Parid in a secondary filing. Connected to the loan was a document that referenced a holding entity Daniel had quietly registered weeks earlier. The language was designed to create the appearance of shared operational authority, not actual legal ownership, but enough ambiguity that someone who did not read carefully might believe Daniel had a legitimate claim. It was not a takeover, it was a performance, constructed on paper, thin enough to collapse under scrutiny, but convincing enough to fool a family that had always wanted to believe Daniel was the capable one. And that was exactly what he planned to do. He did not need the documents to hold up in court. He needed them to hold up at a dinner table. He needed my mother to believe it. He needed my family to see him standing at the head of my company with a glass raised, looking like the man who had saved his overwhelmed little sister from herself. The truth did not matter to Daniel. The audience did. Back at the table, Daniel was just getting started. He set his wine glass down slowly, savoring the room the way a man does when he believes he has already won. He loosened his collar, leaned back, and began telling the story he had clearly been rehearsing for weeks. He told everyone that my company had been on the verge of collapse. He said that without his intervention, I would have lost everything. He described himself as the one who stepped in, made the calls, secured the funding, and ultimately saved a business I was too overwhelmed to manage on my own. He used words like restructured and operational authority, words he barely understood but knew would impress a room full of people who understood them even less. My mother nodded along, like she was watching her son accept an award. My aunt tilted her head with that particular brand of pity reserved for women who try too hard and fall short. My uncle raised his glass in Daniel's direction without even looking at me. And my cousin, the one who had laughed earlier thinking it was a joke, leaned over and whispered, "So do you still work there, or is it fully his now?" That one landed. I will not pretend it did not. Daniel kept going. He talked about future plans, expansion ideas, new hires he intended to make. He painted a picture of himself as a visionary who had swooped in at the last moment to rescue something fragile from someone who did not know how to protect it. Every sentence was designed to shrink me in front of the people I had grown up with, to confirm the story they had always preferred, that Daniel was the capable one and I was the one who needed saving. He looked at me when he finished, not with cruelty exactly, but with something worse. Satisfaction. The deep, settled satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally taken his rightful place above someone who had quietly outgrown him. The room waited for me to cry, to argue, to crumble the way they expected me to. Some of them looked uncomfortable, most of them looked curious, none of them defended me, but I had stopped needing their defense a long time ago. Something shifted inside me at that table, not anger, not heartbreak, but clarity, cold, steady, unshakable clarity. Because while Daniel had been rehearsing his speech, I had been sitting with the truth for 11 days already. And the truth was something no toast could survive. 11 days before Thanksgiving, my accountant flagged something unusual. A holding entity had appeared in a secondary filing connected to the bridge loan, one I had never authorized. She pulled the thread, and within 48 hours, the full picture emerged. Daniel had registered a shell company using language that mirrored my business structure just enough to create confusion. The documents tied to Richard's loan referenced this entity in a way that implied shared operational authority. But when my attorney reviewed everything line by line, the conclusion was immediate. Daniel owned nothing. Not a share. Not a vote. Not a decision. The filing had no legal weight. The holding entity had no contractual connection to my company. The bridge loan I signed contained no transfer of ownership, no equity stake, and no authority clause. What Daniel had built was not a takeover. It was a costume, a paper-thin illusion designed for an audience that would never ask to see the receipts. My attorney had already prepared revocation letters and a cease and desist. My accountant had documented every irregularity. Everything was in motion before I drove to my mother's house that Thursday. So when Daniel raised his glass and announced he owned my company, I smiled, because he had just told his biggest lie in front of every witness I would ever need. I waited until the silence after his performance had fully settled, until every eye in the room had nowhere left to look but at me. Then I spoke quietly, the way you speak when you do not need volume to be heard. Thank you, Daniel. Truly. I'm glad you said all of that in front of everyone. His smile flickered. I reached into my bag beside my chair and placed a slim folder on the table between the cranberry sauce and the bread basket. I opened it to the first page and read one line aloud, the legal summary my attorney had prepared, confirming that the holding entity Daniel registered had no contractual connection, no equity interest, and no operational authority over my company. You own nothing, I said. You never did. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the folder like it had materialized from nowhere. His voice came back louder, sharper, already cracking at the edge. That's not what Richard said. Richard's been served too, I said. The room went completely still. What happened next was almost harder to watch than the lie. Daniel started talking fast, then faster, reaching for explanations that contradicted each other before he finished them. First it was a misunderstanding, then it was a technicality. Then he said he had only been trying to protect me. No one rescued him, not my mother. Not my aunt, not even my uncle, who had lifted his glass for him less than 5 minutes earlier. The same room that had leaned toward his confidence now recoiled from it. My mother looked at me once as if searching for a way to make this less ugly, but I gave her nothing. No comfort, no anger, no permission to smooth it over. I closed the folder, stood up, and reached for my coat. No one stopped me, and for the first time in that house, the silence belonged to him. I used to think ownership meant paperwork, signatures, titles, the things people point to when they want power to look official, but that night taught me something else. Ownership is not just what your name is attached to. It is what you built when no one believed in you. It is what survived their dismissal, their mockery, their sudden interest once there was something worth taking. Daniel wanted the appearance of my life more than the weight of earning it. And that is true of a lot of people who underestimate quiet women. They think silence means weakness. They think calm means confusion. They think if you do not announce your worth, it can be reassigned. They were wrong. I did not leave Thanksgiving feeling triumphant. I left clear. Some people will only ever respect what they can control, and when they cannot control you, They will try to rewrite your story. Let them try. Just make sure you know where the truth is, and smile when they hand you the moment they should have feared.